What's up? Alexander here with Date Psychology. So, gonna bring some new research for you today. My own research here, the first research on so-called alpha widows, the alpha widow phenomenon. So let's explain what that is, look at what we did here, and go on forward now. So some of you have heard this term, right? It's kind of a manosphere term. You could call it a piece of like manosphere, red pill, folk psychology, right? Folk psychology being things that, popular culture might believe about human psychology, about the mind, just kind of meme beliefs, popular beliefs that form out there. So this is an example of that, right? So what we're looking at here is kind of a phenomenon where a woman who has a so-called high value man will compare future partners to him, right? So we're kind of just looking at comparing current partners to past partners, not being satisfied with current partners because you've had better partners in the past, right? It's not a totally new idea. Certainly this idea, people that can't get over their exes, they ruminate about past partners. They think, I could do better because I had someone better in the past, that sort of a thing. These occur outside of the manosphere as well, but here we're kind of giving it this new term and making it relevant, for the younger generation or whoever the audience or consumers of manosphere content are, right? So looking at things like rumination over past partners. It could be exes, it could be casual sex partners. One quotation that I read when doing the background research for this, even 5 minutes with an alpha can alpha widow a woman. So even just brief exposure, right? That kind of a thing. But we're looking at someone who can't get over an ex or past partner primarily, right? The idea that a past mate sets a new standard and it's kind of permanent, so there's higher future standards. So no one else is going to live up to this alpha. They still think about them, can't get over them, that sort of a thing. Kind of an entitlement, right, to this ideal man, like I've had him in the past, so I'm going to be able to get someone like that in the future. That's what I deserve, right? And then also, current relationship dissatisfaction due to this comparison, right? Like, wow, I had the alpha in the past, but now my new guy is not an alpha, he's a beta or whatever, right? And so given that, I'm not as satisfied in the current relationship. I'm just thinking about the alpha, that sort of a thing. So that's kind of what we're looking at. You might ask, why test this at all? Well, something I've noted in the past, the manosphere, the red pill, they seem to claim to like evolutionary psychology a lot. They kind of have this love affair with evolutionary psychology where it kind of filters through them and they give you this weird distorted caricature of what evolutionary psychology is, despite the fact that no one in the manosphere has ever really tested these hypotheses, these claims, right? So if you claim to be supported by evolutionary psychology, then you're also kind of subject to the same methods used in evolutionary psychology. You have to make hypotheses that are testable and that can be falsified. You have to follow the scientific method. The red pill hasn't come up with very much that's new. It's kind of relied heavily, like I said, on evolutionary psychology and borrowed things from it and very often redefined it, right? So like hypergamy means something entirely different in the red pill than it does when the term is used by evolutionary scientists. So you get a lot of things where they can say, oh, I'm talking about hypergamy, and see, hypergamy is science. And so they point to science, but then scientists are talking about something different. They're talking about something different. So kind of a bait and switch there, right? A moving of the goalposts, but that's kind of what we're looking at here. Why test it? Well, we do have this community that creates all of these folk psychological theories about the human mind, human sexuality in particular, human relationships. We could do the same things, that research scientists do to test these. If you're an evolutionary psychologist, this is what you do. And we can take these ideas, we can test them. So let's go on now to the next slide. We made a scale, we'll just call it the alpha widow scale. It has 3 subscales. Probably a strength of this scale is it probably has very high content and construct validity. And so what is that? Does the scale measure what it is intended to measure? In this case, the reason I'm saying it has high content or construct validity, it has high face validity. You can look at the question and say, yeah, it probably is asking about those. But also, we took all of the descriptions of alpha widows, the alpha widow phenomenon from red pill influencers, and we turned them into our scale. Not exactly word for word, but all of the items on the scale are taken directly from the way that popular red pill influencers have described the alpha widow phenomenon. So, when I posted this up on social media initially and all of that, there were immediately people saying, that's not what it is. I mean, according to all of these major red pill influencers, that's what it is, because these are pretty much the way that they describe it. If that's not what it is to you, there's nothing I can do about that. But seems to be that's what it is to many of these influencers and podcasters, that sort of a thing. run the internal reliability checks on this scale. Good internal validity, Cronbach's alpha of 7 or 9. So we know, that these items are correlated with one another. They kind of measure consistently a single construct. And there's 3 subscales to capture the different ways that alpha widows are described in the manosphere, right? Because there's kind of different elements to it, and those can be kind of broken into some different things, right? So there's comparing current partners with past partners. Those past partners could be romantic exes, people you were in a relationship with, or even casual sex partners, right? Remember, 5 minutes with an alpha. So even, a fling could do it, could alpha widow a woman, supposedly. And then we have rumination over casual sex partners. So how much do people think about these casual sex partners? And then also rumination over past exes. So to what extent do people kind of ruminate, think about their past exes, wish they could be with them in a relationship, feel like they're the one that got away, and all of that. Let's go on. I'll read these scale items to you specifically one by one. So comparing past exes to current partners. Here up on the slide, we have some examples. I have an ex or past casual sex partner. So in all of these items, we ask about both. It could be either or, right? Who I would rather have sex with than my current partner, who's more physically attractive than my current partner, who I would be happier with than my current partner, makes me think I could do better than my current partner, right? So the comparisons there, like a new standard. Settled with a current romantic partner because the ex would not commit is another one that we came across. And then also, if I could, I would leave the relationship I'm in and get back together with one of my exes. So kind of looking at, was the breakup involuntarily? Do they regret it? Do they still wish they were together? So let's go on now to the next one. So these are ruminations over casual sex partners, right? So the most physically attractive person I've had a sexual relationship was a casual sex partner. I fantasize about my casual sex partners. I feel like if I missed out by not having a relationship with a casual sex partner, right? Because one description there is that the women could not consolidate on this high-valued man, right? They got sex, they got the opportunity, but he wouldn't commit, couldn't lock him down in a relationship, right? So that alpha widows them, right? So I had a casual sex partner that I wanted a relationship with, but they would not commit. The best sex I've had in my life was with a casual sex partner. So here we're asking some questions about sex and casual partners, and then going on to the last one, rumination over exes. I often look at the social media of one of my exes. I have an ex who I regret not being in a relationship with now. I have an ex who I would consider to be the one that got away. I worry I won't find someone as good as one of my past exes, and the ideal man or ideal woman for me is one of my exes, so kind of that ideal. And then also I consider one of my exes to be my soulmate, right? Because this soulmate idea ties in as well. So we have all of these different things that we're looking at. Let's go on now and address one of these popular objections. Although many of these manosphere communities say, oh, we love evolutionary psychology, it's all based on evolutionary psychology, most of the research in evolutionary psychology involves taking samples of students, right? So non-representative samples, and simply asking them questions. How do you feel? So often, as I have experienced, it turns out to be the case when you actually share research in depth with people from evolutionary psychology, they don't confirm a lot of manosphere narratives, red pill myths, that sort of a thing. And instead what people say is, oh, you can't believe them because they're self-reports, people lie, etc., etc. But we do have ways to detect this and to account for this. So it's certainly not a question that has not been considered in the past. One of these, you can use these social desirability scales. In this, we use the BIDR self-deceptive denial scale. We took the questions from this that actually are considered kind of like banned questions. You can't ask them because these ethical review boards, institutional review boards, they don't let you ask these questions because they're too offensive. So these correlate with the main BIDR, but we took the questions that were like the bad ones, right? So they ask questions like, would you enjoy seeing someone you didn't like getting killed on the news or something like that? So, maybe people admitting things that they're not comfortable to admit. Do they have a desire to commit SA, right? Things like that. So these questions that are supposed to be uncomfortable for participants that they probably don't want to admit the most, those are the questions that we use. What do we expect? If people are self-deceiving themselves, or if they're reporting in socially desirable ways, on one scale, on our BIDR, we should see it correlate with another scale that is also subject to social desirability bias or to self-deception, right? Because this is a trait. Some people are more honest, some people are less honest. People that are more honest are going to be more honest across the board, just as a personality trait, right? And people who are a little bit less honest, who are more subject to social desirability bias, are going to be less. So you see correlations here. And typically across the research, what we know in general is This is not a strong effect. Social desirability bias, people like to use as an excuse, like they can just dismiss everything. Correlations between sexual questions, relationship questions, and social desirability bias, are about 0.2. So, they explain about 5% of the variance, 4% of the variance. In the largest cases, about 10% of the variance. So this is a real effect, but it doesn't typically shift results very much. This is even true when you look at the lie detector studies. That's about as much as it shifts questions unrelated to sexual behavior, right? About 10% of the variance. So people are mostly honest, but we can test this, and we can test it in multiple ways looking at a scale like this. But I think it's important to address this first, because people see results they don't like and they say, well, I'm not going to believe it. I'm just going to believe my feelings instead. It's kind of a cope, but this is going to be a cope-free zone. If you want to claim that evolutionary psychology is backing you up and all of that, you don't get to just pick and choose from the self-reported results that you want to believe, right? You got to follow the methodology across the board and subject your hypotheses, your beliefs, your theories to empirical testing, and this is how it is done. So, going on now to the next slide. Let's go ahead and look at some results and some correlations first with the BIDR. What do we see? Remember, we expect if there is an effective social desirability bias for these kinds of questions, maybe people don't want to admit that they're ruminating over an X or whatever the case may be, we should see correlations with these other questions, right? But we don't. You can look down at the bottom, I have it highlighted in red. We don't see correlations with our 3 subscales and BID scores, so we can rule out social desirability bias in this case, or at least we can rule out that it's a meaningful effect. Could be there, but if it is, it's very small. We can't detect it past significance, right? We do see a small one, also very small, at 0.13 for lifetime relationship number, which is kind of a weird one, right? So people who score higher on the BIDR also report having more relationships, but not more casual sex partners. Maybe that's a status thing as well. Not really a lot of sex differences on this, so it's not split. When I ran it by sex, you get the same outcome. So that's what we're looking at here. We can kind of rule that out, but we can also look at it in other ways. Another way is to compare our BID scores with a group that we consider to be more honest. So we can split our sample into groups, and we can say, who are the honest people? Who are the ones that aren't going to lie? Because of course, the idea is that women lie more and people that aren't red-pilled lie more, but red-pilled people, of course, are much more willing to admit these hard truths about themselves and all of that. So we can see, does the rest of our sample lie more, or do they have higher social desirability scores, higher self-deception than red-pilled men do? And the answer is no. Running the ANOVA here, we see the results. No difference. In fact, the red-pilled men scored a little bit lower than the other group. So red-pilled men were less likely to admit these undesirable things about themselves, although it was not a significant result. Maybe in a larger sample it would be, but it's not. So we know that our sample here is at least as honest as red-pilled men are. Let's go on now to the next one. We can also compare these BID scores. We can just look at the distribution, right? We can see how willing are people to admit bad things about themselves across the board. Hard to admit truths and all of that. And up on the slide here, we can see that. That's the distribution in yellow or orange or something like that. It's the one that is further to the right. So we see actually very few low scores. People don't just go through and just say all of the most socially desirable things. They actually tend to admit a lot of bad things about themselves on an anonymous survey. In fact, they're more inclined to admit bad things about themselves than they are not. And in gray or blue, the other distribution is our subscales. And we see here, they're very, very low. So there's 2 interpretations of that. Maybe asking about rumination about an ex is the most controversial question in the world, right? Like no one would ever admit that, but they will admit that they want to SA somebody, right? So that's not very plausible. Or it could just be that they're low scores because they're actually low. Most people don't seem to feel that way or agree with those things. But, this is a good way to rule out, like, hey, is the sample just saying the good things about themselves? Mostly they're not. Anyway, let's go on. We can go into the results now that perhaps some of this cope has been addressed. We can look at the results for our scale, just looking at the SC subscale, which is social comparisons. How much do people compare their current partners with exes or past casual sex partners, and what does that correlate with? So we see positive correlations here. That correlates more with having more lifetime sex partners more lifetime casual sex partners, and more relationships, right? So this makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Because if you have more past partners, there's more people to compare from, right? And if we didn't see those correlations, maybe that would be suspicious. So that's another indication that we're getting these significant results where we expect them. So, that's some indication, hey, people are answering honestly enough to produce this correlation. That is, perhaps consistent with some part of the alpha widows mythos, right? Kind of this idea like, yeah, someone who's had a lot of past partners is going to score higher as far as comparing their current partners to past partners. If they've had more casual sex, they're going to have more people in the past to compare from, so they're going to do it more. Again, no sex differences on this one, so that's why it's presented together. Same for men and women in this case. If they've had more lifetime sex partners, casual sex partners, or lifetime relationships, they're more likely to compare current partners with past partners, casual or committed. Let's go on now to the next one. Rumination. This is rumination about an ex, okay? So someone that they were in a committed relationship with. Something I should note about the methodology, yeah. For people to be exposed to this scale, to get to it, they're filtered, so they have to have had an ex, right? If someone is comparing a current partner, they have to be in a relationship to do it. So we're asking about people on the last one that are actually in relationships. On this one, we're asking about people that have at least an ex, that kind of a thing, right? So what do we see here? We see correlations again with lifetime sex partners and lifetime casual sex partners. If people have had more partners, they're more likely to ruminate about one of their exes. Perhaps strange in this one that we don't see a correlation with lifetime relationships, but that's what it is. And going on now to the last one. This is the one about fantasizing about past casual sex partners. And no correlation on this and the rumination scale, in lifetime partners, lifetime relationships, lifetime casual sex partners. No correlation with any of these, probably because casual sex partners don't leave as much of an impact as people seem to think. So we can probably rule out the part of the alpha widows mythos there that says 5 minutes of exposure. People are mostly not thinking about their casual sex partners. We did another study recently. We looked at opinions and things about casual sex partners. Those results were also pretty consistent with this. It's probably not the case that people are getting super hung up on their casual partners. Rather, people are getting hung up on partners that they've had more of an emotional bond with. Going on now to the next slide. We see large negative correlations here for people in relationships who have emotional satisfaction and high sexual satisfaction, right? So individuals that have high emotional satisfaction, high sexual satisfaction, they are much less likely to ruminate, to make comparisons with past exes, to think about past casual sex partners. These are pretty large correlations in some cases, right? 0.59, 0.56, 0.69. For psychology, these are large anyway, right? I would call these medium, large sized correlations. So this should also be said, this is most of the sample. The median for emotional satisfaction, relationship satisfaction is about a 6, which is very consistently what you see across research. Anytime you ask about, are you happy in a relationship? Are you sexually satisfied? Are you emotionally satisfied? The majority of your sample almost always will respond highly like yes, right? And why is that? Well, when people get to a point that they're not, often they leave the relationship. So at any given moment when you survey people in relationships, they tend to report really high satisfaction across the board, even if they don't report high sexual frequency. Because I've seen people wonder, how do you reconcile that? Well, some people are saying they're not having sex every week, or they're only having sex twice a month, or whatever the case may be. They still report high sexual satisfaction. Why? Well, maybe they don't want to that much. Who knows? But that's what they say. That's how they feel. Let's go on now to the next one. Sex partners, casual sex, and relationships. Here we see some large positive correlations, right? More lifetime sexual partners, more lifetime casual sex partners. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? More lifetime relationships, more lifetime casual sex partners. Large positive correlation there. And here we have a medium to large one as well, with lifetime sex partners and lifetime relationships. So people who've had more relationships, they've also had more sex and more casual sex. Why is that? Well, contrary to popular belief that people who are having relationships make up this pool of betas or undesirable people, and casual sex people are very desirable, we know that individuals who are more attractive across the board, physically attractive, taller, more intelligent, have more money, more likely to form long-term monogamous relationships. So basically the people that have the most sexual frequency are also going to be the ones that end up in the most long-term relationships or committed relationships as well. Let's go on now to the next. So we've looked at some of these correlations. Now we can look at some sex differences, right? Because the alpha widows phenomenon is described for women, right? It's widows, it's not alpha widowers. Or is it? Maybe it will turn out to be, and it does. Spoiler. So, given that, we can look at some of these sex differences and we can see, is this really just a female phenomenon, or are we looking at something that men and women experience pretty similarly? We can also just look at how common it is, right? So we see across, these are distributions split by sex, t-test on them for each question, and then we'll look at the 3 subscale scores together. But we see it's pretty uncommon for people to compare current and past partners, but men do this more than women. So men are more likely to be comparing their current relationship partner with a past ex or a past casual sex partner. The most common comparison that people seem to make is just if you ask, do you have a past partner who's more attractive, right? So that doesn't mean they're actually thinking about it on a day-to-day basis, but if you ask, they can probably come up with it, right? So yeah, let's go on to the next. Sex difference in rumination over exes. Still uncommon, pretty uncommon, as you can see from these distributions. Again, men do this more too. Men are more likely to regret not dating an ex and worrying that they won't find someone good as an ex. So those are significant differences on those 2 items specifically. Men are more likely than women to think, I missed my chance with an ex. I regret that I couldn't consolidate that relationship. And more likely to think, wow, I had an ex who was really good. Don't think I'm ever going to find someone as good as her. So kind of flipping the alpha widows thing around seems to be that those are more common ruminations in men than women. So again, maybe not alpha widows, maybe it's alpha widowers. Let's go on now to the next slide. And then rumination over casual sex partners as well. Not a lot of differences here. One significant difference is that men are much more likely to fantasize about a past casual sex partner. Probably unsurprising, we know men have more sexual fantasies in general, more sexual cognitions, right? Consistent with sexual strategies theory. Makes sense that we would see it on that. But so we don't see a lot of differences on individual items, but going on to the next slide, we'll see that they do total up to significant differences. So here we see differences in the subscale scores totals. Men are more likely to compare their current partner to past partners, committed or casual. Men are more likely to express a desire for casual sex partners in the past, right? More likely to think about their casual partners. And men are more likely to ruminate over their exes, right? So men actually score higher on all of these rather than alpha widows. Yeah, maybe we should be saying alpha widowers. Let's go on to the next one. We can look at some notable results here. The biggest 2 differences that we see here were on assessments of past partners' physical attractiveness, the biggest for individual items. And given that, we might wonder, why past physical attractiveness? Probably it's one of the more objective comparisons, right? So if you ask someone a question like, physical attractiveness, it's fairly objective. And by that, I mean that there's high agreement on who is attractive and who isn't. It's kind of a question that you can ask someone where they can step back, they can decouple a little bit, and they can say, okay, this person is more attractive than that person. Doesn't mean they like them more or whatever the case may be, but they can make that judgment. Whereas if you ask someone like, are you happier with your current partner or not, you're asking them to compare their emotional states, not to make as much of a objective assessment. So that's probably why we see more people saying, yeah, a past partner was more attractive. Most people didn't say that, but I mean more people relative to the other questions. And we can look at results on item SC4, right? In particular, I think they're especially salient to the alpha widows mythos, right? As the Red Pill podcaster Rollo Tomasi has said or wrote, he said, when a woman misses the opportunity to consolidate on a confirmed high SMV male, that man becomes the new standard for what she believes she can attract. So the idea like, oh, I was with someone, but I couldn't lock them down, and now they're the new standard, right? Well, men score higher on this. So yeah, the results seem to indicate this applies more to male psychology than it does to female psychology. Let's go on now. A big difference here, I should mention. Cohen's D of 0.51. Anyway, going on to the next one. Biggest sex differences were for sexual items. So after running this, I split the items. I said, okay, which of these are about emotions? Which of these are about sex? And we see the biggest sex differences on questions about sex. So men are much more likely to say they have sexual fantasies about a past ex, any question about sex, then you see a much larger difference. For emotional differences, they were smaller, and they weren't even significant between men and women. So men and women, the same, or at least we can't reject the null, right? We can't actually say they're actually the same, but we can say they're not significantly different from one another. Why is that? Well, if you remember David Buss' sexual strategies theory, we expect male and female mating psychology to be different, where men and women have faced different adaptive problems ancestrally, right? One of those is in short-term mating. Men and women have a very different short-term mating psychology. Men are much more oriented towards short-term mating. Meanwhile, we expect men and women to be similar as far as mating psychology, where the adaptive problems are similar. And that occurs in long-term relationship formation. Commitment, fidelity, those sorts of things. Falling in love, experiencing jealousy. These are all very similar things. Not that we don't ever see sex differences here, but they're much smaller. And the current results are consistent with that. On the emotional questions that pertain, to long-term relationship formation, that kind of a thing, no significant sex differences. On the sexual questions, a big one, where men are much more likely to have their mind elsewhere on a past partner or an ex or something like that. So men and women, we can say they have the same or similar emotional rumination, but men have much more sexual rumination than women do. Let's go on now to the next one. We can talk about these results in the context of error management theory, right? This was developed by Hasselton and Buss. Error management theory, it explains kind of cognitive biases in human mating psychology. We know that human beings have a lot of cognitive biases, and we might think like, why do we have these things? We shouldn't be biased. Wouldn't it be great to just see the world accurately for what it is? But we know that the human mind is littered with these cognitive biases, and they help us in situations that would have been adaptive, right? So, we don't, in a dangerous situation, we don't say, the probability that I'm going to get attacked by a tiger over there in the long grass is 0.5, so I'm just going to ignore it. We just think like, tiger, long grass, it's dangerous, right? We overestimate danger, for example. That's a cognitive bias there. We have these in relationships too, and they facilitate, mating challenges, right? They solve problems. They facilitate mating outcomes in that sense. One of those is facilitating long-term relationship formation and maintenance. Now, one of those cognitive biases comes in the form of what's called positive illusions. We see our current partners better than others do. So people rate their current romantic partner as more attractive, smarter, having a better personality than objective ratings do, as more intelligent than they objectively score on IQ tests. All of these things, we see our partners as the best person in the world. Why? Well, if you see your partner as being the best person in the world, you're going to be more likely to stay with them. If you don't, you're going to be more likely to leave. But, human beings are a serially monogamous species. We have this really long gestation period that requires, a mother and a father to raise a child into adulthood, that sort of a thing. So maintaining a relationship for a long period of time is basically the most adaptive human strategy for fitness in that sense. Women, we know, again, going back to sexual strategies theory, more oriented toward long-term relationship formation. So we should expect women to have these biases as stronger, right? They should have fewer cognitions that jeopardize these relationships. In the paper we're going to see in the next slide, they talk about a meta-analysis and a lot of theory behind that. Again, Hasselton and Galperin. And basically that supports that, that women see their partners more positively and they are more attuned toward problems in the relationship, like conflict or things that would indicate like, oh, he might leave, right? So basically, we should expect women to think less of rivals. We should expect women to think less of alternative potential mates and that kind of a thing. And the current results that we have here are consistent with that. Women have their mind elsewhere less than men do, right? Men lose more, important part of EMT here, men lose more from missed sexual opportunities. That's one reason that men tend to over-perceive sexual interest in women, especially if they're interested in that woman, right? So men lose more from the evolutionary point of view from missed sexual opportunities. So men probably, in our current results, regret these past losses more, and they fantasize about alternatives more. Men gain more from these short-term encounters than women do. Women don't tend to gain that much from short-term encounters from the evolutionary perspective. Mating for women, selecting good genes and a good investor, they're pretty closely linked, contrary to the way that it's often presented in the manosphere, that sort of a thing. So paper there to read about error management theory if you want to look up on that. And going on to the next slide, another paper covering this, error management theory, positive illusions, that sort of a thing, by Hasselton and Galperin. Here's a quotation from that. Women are, on average, more oriented toward relationship maintenance than men are because a committed relationship was probably more strongly related to women's reproductive success than men's. Because of this, the error symmetry of evaluating the partner in the relationship was enhanced for women relative to men, such that it was especially costly for women to underestimate the partner's qualities, so women have stronger positive illusions, or underestimate emerging threats to the relationship, right? So being more able to see like, oh, things are not going in a good direction. Is he going to cheat? Is his mind elsewhere? And so we can also apply that to the current results, right? I think this is a good framework for understanding that, because where our own cognitions are can also facilitate or jeopardize a relationship. If your mind is elsewhere, somewhere else, and you're considering rival mates and all of that, we know that's one of the best predictors actually of infidelity, is just how much people give attention to potential attractive rivals, right? So the more people do that, yeah, much higher chance of cheating, and cheating, one of the worst ways to maintain a long-term relationship. One of the top reasons that they dissolve. Anyway, going on now to the next slide. Results summary here. What have we learned? What can we sum up? Well, this is probably the first empirical test of a manosphere folk theory, right? We know that these alpha widows, at least in our sample, rare overall, not a common thing, so probably not something you need to worry about that much. More likely to be men as well, especially on sexual items, so consistent with sexual strategies theory. These are more likely for people who've had more relationships and more past sexual partners. So that's kind of consistent with the alpha widows folk theory, isn't it, right? Yeah, more partners, more people to compare to. Kind of obvious one. It's much more likely to occur when current relationship satisfaction is low. So people think about their past partners and all of that. They got their mind elsewhere on other partners when they're not happy in the current relationship, when they're not emotionally satisfied and they're not sexually satisfied. We know our scale scores were not associated with self-deception or social desirability bias, so we can rule that out. And error management theory, positive illusions in this case, provides kind of a theoretical framework for why we see the results that we do, right? Why people in relationships, especially when they're happy, don't compare their current partners to exes or even think about them all that much. Let's go on now to the next slide. Some final thoughts on this. As I mentioned, human beings form long-term pair bonds. We are primarily a serially monogamous species. That's the dominant human mating pattern. But we also have these adaptations for short-term mating, don't we? Right? People cheat, people commit infidelity, people have hookups, and all of that. So we have these two things. We're not a species that just mates for life, and then if the mate dies, we die. There's some animals like that, where if they lose the mate, it's, it just destroys them. Human beings don't seem to be quite that way. What would happen to human beings if we just got permanently attached and like permanently severely damaged from failed relationships in a serially monogamous species with infidelity and adaptations for short-term mating? Well, it wouldn't be very adaptive, would it? Right? Because we're expected to have multiple relationships in a sense. So we must have adaptations that facilitate the formation of multiple relationships. What should we expect if that's the case? Well, that we have adaptations to maintain relationships over the long term, so we get very attached. We fall in love, right? The feeling of love is one adaptation for long-term relationship maintenance. Jealousy, mate guarding, right, for long-term relationship maintenance. But we also have adaptations to recover when those relationships end, when they fail, right? You don't just dwell on them the rest of your life. Most people get over relationships pretty quickly. It's about 2 weeks to a month on average when they're just like, I don't really think about them that much anymore. So we also seem to have these adaptations to recover from grief, right? To get over from grief. People move on, and that's kind of what we should expect in a serially monogamous species. Not that people are continually fixated on an ex or a past partner, but that it hurts, there's grief and all of that, love that kind of maintains the long-term relationship, but when it ends, and people get over it and they move on. Let's go on now to the last one here. We can also ask, what motivates a belief in alpha widows? Why is this a popular narrative? What is going on with people that they like this, right? Well, there's probably some truth to it in the sense that we've all met someone who's struggled at some point in their life to get over a past relationship, right? We have, nothing in the manosphere is especially new. We have, the idea of the one that got away. So, the idea, I had people commenting when I posted the results of this, like, well, what about the Titanic? Well, for one, it's a movie, that's written by a man. It's not a real story. So let's not try to learn too much about human psychology from a fictional story. But, it is an archetype, a narrative there that sometimes people get fixated on someone and they ruminate and they don't get over it. the one that got away, right? The manosphere has not discovered anything new in that sense. And we might have met someone like that, right? But think about this. Is it you? Is it you? Are you that person? Probably not. Consider this probably is not the experience of most person, right? Most people. Most people are probably not just dwelling on an ex. You're probably not. Well, they're probably not either, right? Another motivation could just be revenge fantasies. This seems to motivate a lot of manosphere discourse, right? So kind of this desire to believe that a woman who has once rejected you, or maybe all women have rejected you, or something like that, they're also going to be rejected by Chad, right? I was rejected by all these women, but they're going to grow old and they're going to hit the wall, and Chad is going to reject them, and Chad is going to pump and dump them, and they're going to be permanently damaged from it. Haha, got him. So revenge fantasy, one other motive. And a final motive could also just be kind of a cope. Following a breakup, right? We talked about the one that got away. Well, people telling themselves, I'm the one that got away. I mean, that reduces kind of the blow to self-esteem when a relationship ends, when you've been dumped, even if you're the one that initiated the breakup, right? There can be, retrospective sadness or regrets or whatever, like, maybe I wasn't that great, I bet they think about me and all of that. So it can be a cope following the breakup, just a way to tell yourself, I'm the one that got away. And when I was writing this, I Googled the phrase, I alpha widowed her. And yeah, just countless stories of men on these red pill manosphere forums saying, yeah, I alpha widowed this girl and da 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 da. Yeah, I mean, clearly this is men bragging to each other anonymously on the internet. Wouldn't take that for very much from these stories that could be just entirely made up with men bragging to each other. But, I'm sure people tell themselves that when a relationship ends and they think like, I'm the best that she'll ever have and blah, blah, blah. So it's kind of a cope that way, right? It makes you feel better. Anyway, hope you liked the video. That's all I got for you today. Like, subscribe, hit the bell. We have a Patreon if you want to support the project. We're running a lot of these experiments, testing the things that maybe a lot of people in the manosphere don't know how to test or won't test because they don't want to subject these theories to an empirical review, that kind of a thing. Follow the website. Hope you liked the video. I'll make another for you very soon.